This video is different from most explainers on this topic, not because it will tell you who is right and who is wrong. It will not do that, and neither should you trust anyone who claims the answer is simple. It is different because it starts from where things actually stand today, July 16, 2026, where a ceasefire that most of the world was hoping would hold just collapsed. Both sides are exchanging strikes again. The Strait of Hormuz is being contested by US and Iranian forces simultaneously, and oil prices are rising for the fourth consecutive day. This conflict is not in the past tense, it is in the present tense, and the economic consequences are still being written. So here is the full picture: how this war started, why it started, what it has already cost, and what is genuinely at stake if it does not end. Start with the geography and the economics, because both matter before a single word of history makes sense. The Strait of Hormuz is a strip of water 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point between Iran and Oman. Through this strait, under normal conditions, flows roughly 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products per day, approximately 1/5 of all global petroleum consumption. Roughly 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas also transits here, essentially the entirety of Qatar's LNG export capacity, with no viable pipeline alternative. The strait also carries Gulf region exports that account for roughly 45% of global sulfur and 50% of global urea, both critical inputs to fertilizer production. Qatar produces around 40% of the world's helium, essential for semiconductor manufacturing, MRI machines, and aerospace components. One waterway, 1/5 of global oil, 1/5 of global LNG, nearly half of global fertilizer inputs. This is not a regional choke point. It is a global one, and Iran controls the northern bank. To understand why this conflict happened, you need to understand what the previous 20 years did to Iran's economy. The United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action nuclear agreement in 2018 and reimposed sweeping sanctions. The Biden administration maintained most of those sanctions. Trump's second administration continued maximum pressure. In September 2025, the United Nations reimposed sanctions on Iran through the snapback mechanism, causing another collapse in the Iranian currency and new spikes in food prices. By late 2025, Iran's leading financial daily had already modeled 3 scenarios for 2026 inflation: 49% under a peace settlement, 67% under the status quo, 123% under open conflict. Iran's economy was not entering this conflict from a position of stability. It was entering it already deep in crisis, with inflation above 50%, a currency in free fall, factories operating below capacity due to chronic energy shortages, a major private bank just collapsed, and merchants who had shuttered their shops in protest, triggering mass demonstrations that the regime suppressed with force. In December 2025, anti-government protests erupted and spread across the country into January 2026. According to Iranian health ministry officials, at least 30,000 people were killed in the security forces' crackdown. The United States, which had been encouraging the protests, began what officials described as its largest military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The crackdown had its own economic consequence. International condemnation deepened isolation. Foreign investment, which had been virtually frozen by sanctions for years, became even less plausible. The already fragile private sector contracted further. By February 2026, Iran's economy was in the kind of condition where a war does not break things that were working. It accelerates the collapse of things that were already failing. Before the main war, there was an opening act. In June 2025, Israel launched what became known as the 12-Day War, a series of strikes against Iranian nuclear and military facilities. The US also participated in striking Iranian nuclear sites. The conflict ended in a ceasefire, but it did not end the underlying tension. It accelerated it. Iran's nuclear program was damaged but not destroyed. Its currency entered another freefall after the episode. And the events of the 12-Day War became one of the direct justifications cited for what happened next. Why? On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. US and Israeli airstrikes targeted Iranian leadership and military infrastructure in what was described as a decapitation strike. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Iran retaliated immediately with missile and drone strikes against US and Israeli targets and against Gulf states hosting American military forces. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps formally declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Iran struck 2 commercial tankers attempting transit. Tanker traffic through the strait fell by 80%. The International Energy Agency described what followed as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Brent crude, which had been trading around $73 per barrel before the conflict, climbed to $105 per barrel within weeks, a rise of 44%. Petrol prices in the United States rose by more than $1 per gallon. The tanker market seized up almost immediately. Ship owners faced war risk insurance premiums that made commercial transit financially irrational. The International Group of P&I Clubs, which provides liability insurance for roughly 90% of the world's ocean-going tonnage, suspended coverage for the region. Without insurance, most legitimate commercial operators would not risk sending vessels through. The U.S. Central Command reported that more than 140 commercial ships were turned around or diverted during the initial blockade phase alone. Hundreds of tankers were effectively stranded in the Persian Gulf, unable to offload, reroute, or return, sitting on cargoes worth billions of dollars with nowhere to go. The economic shock moved immediately into every supply chain with energy in it, which is every supply chain. Shipping insurance war risk premiums became prohibitively expensive. Companies rerouted vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 2 to 3 weeks to journey times and consuming significant additional fuel in the process, which in turn added further pressure to oil demand against already constrained supply. European gas storage had entered the winter of 2025 to 2026 at just 30% capacity. With Qatari LNG now unable to transit the strait freely, Dutch TTF gas benchmarks, Europe's natural gas price reference, nearly doubled to over €60 per megawatt hour by mid-March. The European Central Bank postponed planned interest rate cuts. UK inflation was projected to breach 5% for 2026. Industrial producers across Europe began imposing energy surcharges of up to 30%. The conflict also disrupted supply chains that most people had never thought of as connected to Persian Gulf geography. Qatar's helium exports, roughly 40% of world supply, were stranded. Fertilizer inputs from the Gulf region, representing nearly half of global sulfur and urea exports, stopped flowing normally. The food price consequence of that disruption does not arrive immediately. It works on a 6 to 9 month lag, feeding into harvest yields after the planting seasons that were disrupted. Crops that did not receive adequate fertilizer in the second quarter of 2026 will show up in food prices in late 2026 and into 2027. The economic damage from this conflict is not finished arriving even as you watch this. Iran's economic damage is the most acute. The Iranian government's own estimates put war damage at approximately $270 billion against a projected 2026 GDP of around $300 billion. That is damage equivalent to roughly 90% of an entire year's economic output. The IMF projects Iran's 2026 inflation will exceed 70%. As of July 2026, annual inflation is running at 50.6% and rising. The Iranian rial has collapsed to record lows. Bread and cereal prices are up 140% year-on-year. Meat is up 135%. Dairy products are up 116%. Oil and fats are up over 200%. 138,000 civilian sites in Iran were damaged during the initial phase of fighting. Iranian economic officials have warned their president that economic recovery could take more than a decade. China, wary of secondary sanctions exposure, has maintained a cautious posture. Russia is consumed by its own budget pressures. Gulf neighbors whose infrastructure Iran struck are focused on rerouting their own energy flows rather than financing Iranian reconstruction. For the United States, the cost through June 2026 was estimated at $113.3 billion in direct military expenditure. EY Parthenon economists projected the war would drag U.S. GDP growth from 2.1% in 2025 to 1.8% in 2026. Consumer price inflation reached 3.3%, the highest level since May 2024, driven primarily by energy prices. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Index was projected to approach 4% by year's end, double the Federal Reserve's target. The prospect of interest rate cuts dimmed as persistent inflation made rate increases more likely instead. Mortgage rates climbed back above 6.25%. Trump's approval ratings fell as polls showed voters dissatisfied with both the conflict itself and its economic effects on their daily costs. For the global economy, the OECD cut its 2026 growth forecast from 3.4% in 2025 to 2.8% in a baseline scenario, warning it could fall to 2.1% under prolonged disruption. The IMF issued recession risk warnings for the global economy. Goldman Sachs noted that markets had priced the inflationary shock, but had not yet fully priced the growth shock, which it described as the next shoe to drop. The Global Peace Index calculated that successful diplomacy to end the war would be worth more than $2.2 trillion to the global economy in a single year. Gulf states and Iraq lost approximately $1.1 billion per day collectively in oil export revenues, while the strait remained closed. Egypt saw approximately $6 billion flee its financial markets within weeks, with its currency falling more than 8%. India began rationing natural gas. Vietnam experienced fuel shortages and panic buying. Diplomacy moved in parallel with the military action. Pakistan brokered a 2-week ceasefire beginning April 8th. The ceasefire held partially, with both sides violating it intermittently, before Trump extended it indefinitely in late April. After 2 months of difficult negotiations, a 14-point memorandum of understanding was announced on June 14th by Pakistan's Prime Minister and signed on June 17th. Trump at the Palace of Versailles, Iran's President Pezeshkian in Tehran. The MOU formally ended the U.S. naval blockade, required Iran to allow safe passage of commercial ships, promised sanctions relief to Iran including a broad waiver on oil sanctions, and committed to a reconstruction and development plan. It was the agreement that diplomats, economists, and markets had been waiting for. Oil prices fell. The strait partially reopened. Shipping began to recover. It lasted less than 3 weeks. On July 6th, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps struck 3 commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, including a Qatari LNG tanker. Iran's hardliners had never accepted that the MOU meant giving up their leverage over the strait. The U.S. responded with retaliatory strikes on Iranian military targets. Iran struck U.S. military bases across the Gulf. On July 8th, Trump declared the ceasefire over. The U.S. reimposed its naval blockade by July 13th. U.S. and Iranian forces have been exchanging strikes in the days since. Brent crude jumped 9.6% in a single session and rose again the following day. As of today, July 16th, Brent crude is trading at approximately $86 per barrel, significantly below its $105 peak, but rising again on each new escalation. The MOU is effectively dead. Negotiations have stalled. Trump has threatened to strike Iranian bridges and power plants. Iran has threatened to completely close the strait and strike energy and desalination infrastructure, critical for drinking water across the Gulf. The UN Secretary General has described the situation as an imminent threat to civilian lives far beyond the conflict zone. This is where things stand. And this is why the title of this video says could shake, not has shaken, because the trajectory is genuinely unresolved. There are meaningful scenarios in both directions. Trump's approach to the strait has itself introduced new economic uncertainty. During the reimposition of the blockade in July, the administration briefly announced a 20% reimbursement fee on all cargo moving through the Strait of Hormuz, before rescinding the idea and replacing it with a proposal that Gulf states should instead make direct investments in the United States as compensation for American naval protection. Neither approach has a legal framework, historical precedent, or clear implementation mechanism. What it signals to shipping companies and insurers is that the terms of passage through the world's most important energy corridor are now subject to negotiation by the U.S. president in real time, which is its own form of economic risk premium building into every energy contract and shipping rate globally. If diplomacy produces a genuine and durable agreement that reopens the Strait of Hormuz and stabilizes the region, the economic dividend is enormous. The Global Peace Index estimated that a genuine settlement could return $2.2 trillion to global economic activity in a single year. Oil prices would fall toward pre-war levels, reducing inflation globally, enabling the Federal Reserve and other central banks to cut rates, easing mortgage markets, reducing the cost of goods across every supply chain with energy in it, which again is all of them. Iran's reconstruction, if foreign capital can access the country under a sanctions relief framework, would itself generate economic activity across construction, infrastructure, and energy sectors. If the conflict drags on through the end of 2026, Wood Mackenzie modeled a scenario in which Brent crude approaches $200 per barrel, global oil demand contracts by 6 million barrels per day, and the world economy contracts. Fertilizer shortages from disrupted planting seasons will feed into food prices late this year, regardless of the military outcome. European energy insecurity will persist through at least one more winter. India and other developing economies dependent on Gulf oil face structural adjustment to higher energy costs. Iran's economy, already at an estimated 90% war damage to GDP ratio, faces a reconstruction challenge with no clear external financing source. The cost scorecard, even at a partial accounting, is significant. The war cost U.S. taxpayers approximately $113 billion through June 2026, not counting the reimposed blockade and fresh strikes in July. Iran's self-estimated war damage of approximately $270 billion represents nearly its entire annual GDP. The global cost in oil supply disruption alone, before accounting for LNG, fertilizer, and financial market volatility, runs to billions per day. The Global Peace Index estimated the economic dividend of a genuine peace agreement at more than $2.2 trillion to the global economy in a single year. That figure, the gap between war and peace expressed as economic output, is one of the clearest measures available of what is at stake in the diplomatic negotiations that have so far failed to produce a durable result. The fundamental structural problem that prevents an easy resolution is one that economics can describe clearly even if politics cannot solve it. Iran's hardliners view control of the Strait of Hormuz as their primary remaining leverage over both the United States and the global economy. As long as they hold that card, they have a negotiating position. Surrendering it means surrendering leverage without a guarantee that the US and Israel will not simply resume pressure after the war. The US wants a fully open waterway and an end to Iran's nuclear program. Iran wants sovereignty over the strait, security guarantees against future attack, war reparations, and international recognition that it will not be attacked again. These are not positions that split the difference easily. The Southern Center, a respected think tank focused on global security, assessed this week that the US may have reached what it called a strategic dead end, unable to accomplish its core goals through any level of escalation that Congress or the American public would accept, and yet no diplomatic formula has yet bridged the fundamental gap between what each side requires. What this conflict has already confirmed, regardless of how it ends, is something economists had been warning about for years. Global supply chains built around the assumption of stable passage through a single 33-kilometer choke point were always carrying more risk than commodity prices reflected. The Strait of Hormuz was a known vulnerability. It was modeled in scenario analyses. It appeared in risk reports from energy agencies, think tanks, and central banks around the world. And none of that modeling prevented the dependency from deepening year by year, because cheap access to Gulf energy was cheaper than the investment required to reduce it. That calculation has now been made very visibly incorrect. The war that could shake the global economy is not a hypothetical. It is the context in which oil prices are moving today, in which central bank decisions are being made, in which fertilizer inputs for crops that will be harvested in late 2026 were either secured or not secured in the spring. The economic consequences of February 28, 2026 are still unfolding. And as of today, nobody knows whether the next chapter of this conflict is diplomacy or escalation. Subscribe if you want to understand the economic story behind the headlines.